Just how big a deal is this change that we expected, by the way, Apple moving away from Intel chips, moving into its own chips? What does that mean for the overall Apple ecosystem?
Yeah, I think it certainly gives them more control over the product and the services and the experience end to end. So, if they've got that capability and they've got that talent set, why not control more of the product end to end? It gives them more flexibility, certainly.
So developers, however, need to be on board in order for this shift to work, because it's a change in the hardware, which means that developers are going to have to make fresh apps that will work across all of Apple devices. What's been your take on the pushback that we've seen from developers about this 30% cut that Apple, to be fair, for many, many years has taken from the products and services sold via the platform? Do you think that right now there's something different happening?
Well, I think there is something different happening on at least two dimensions. So on one hand, I think if you look at the traditional sale of a one-time game or a one-time app, taking 30% of $1.99 is one scenario, and I think that's worked very well for them over the past decade or so. But then I think where you probably see this tension is more with somebody who's selling a subscription or a service or selling content, which then that begins to feel like a bigger cut, especially when it's of recurring revenue to the third party. And then I think if you look into the future, as more like banks and education and healthcare providers begin to provide services over this platform like telemedicine, I think it becomes more worrisome to those in the future who are thinking, am I going to give 30% of my revenue to Apple?
So do you think that Apple is in any way losing ground here? I mean, if you look at companies like Netflix and Dropbox, they don't give Apple a 30% cut. And I think the argument from developers is that, in some ways it's consistent, but in other ways, depending on the interpretation, the way that Apple has enforced these rules is actually inconsistent.
Yeah, I think it's, there's a lot of nuances in here, and I think that I would go back, Emily, to saying it's hard to look at like everything that's sold through the App Store and say the same rules apply to everything, because there's really, very differences here. In some cases, Apple is enabling an economy or an ecosystem here that wouldn't exist without them, and they add a lot of value in that way. And then in other situations, there's simply, a platform or more of, where it's more of a distribution channel and more of, a commerce or a marketplace for third parties who otherwise wouldn't have an outlet. But, as we look forward, especially when we think about the times right now, more consumers being at home, the growth of using mobile as a platform to deliver services that go well beyond where it is today is going to become ever more important. So sorting out the commercialization of this or the business rules, there's a lot at stake for even a lot more industries than there have been in the past.
Meantime, the EU is now pursuing 2 antitrust investigations into Apple, into the App Store, as well as Apple Pay practices. Apple, for its part, has called these investigations disappointing, saying they're advancing baseless complaints from just a handful of companies who want a free ride, that Apple wants to maintain a level playing field where anyone with determination and a great idea can succeed. How big a risk do you think this antitrust scrutiny is from the EU and also the United States, where you've got the House Antitrust Committee, for example, doing a probe into big tech, including Apple?
So I think it's very important for Apple to triumph here, because if you go back in history and you look at the telecom providers, the AT&Ts and Vodafones of the world that build out an infrastructure, both a wireless infrastructure and a broadband infrastructure that's been commoditized over time, they haven't benefited in the same way, let's say, as Facebook or Google or Apple has, given the capital outlays they had to provide this infrastructure. And if I were Apple, I wouldn't want to see that replicated, where, the devices or the platforms that they're building, become commoditized and they're left out of, the upside that the value that it generates.
So more broadly, what's your take on some of the other, absolutely, what's your take on some of the other software updates that were unveiled today? A hand washing monitor for the Apple Watch, the ability to use the iPhone as a car key. Those are the more sort of buzzy developments. But more broadly, you're seeing pretty dramatic changes to the overall look and feel of the software.
Oh, I'm sorry. To me, Julie? Or Kaylee?
Hey, Julie. Julie, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Sorry. Yeah. So
looks like we've lost.
Yeah,
oh, there she is. Just one last question. I'm not sure if you heard my question, but I asked just your take on the overall software updates and how dramatic they were today.
Yeah, so I think they are very dramatic, and they do so the design chops that Apple has, both from a hardware and a software perspective. If we look at both what consumers are looking for from these devices and the experience, as well as enterprises, they're certainly looking for more seamless experiences across the devices, and Apple achieved that. And I think more importantly, and perhaps more subtle, is their use of context to make these services more relevant to me, whether it's the content I want, my activity bars at the end of the day, the news at the beginning of the day, setting my alarm for me. So, we've always worried, and we've always known that mobile experiences in the future, or the interface, would become more contextual, and these devices would begin to act on my behalf and do things for me. But the challenge has always been, how do you do that without seeming creepy? So I think Apple did a really good job today of balancing, hey, we're using a lot of context and information that we have about you to simplify experiences, but on the other hand, here's all the things that we're doing to protect your privacy. So I think they addressed those two big issues, and I think it's a big step forward in terms of the experience and how intuitive it will be. I don't know that consumers will be able to articulate specifically what it is, but I think they're just going to say, I love it. It's so easy to use. It just works, but there's a lot of engineering that goes into that.